Day 13. We'd rolled back into the church just about after midnight. Sadie was waiting for her husband to come home with her daughter. When she saw them, she ran out to meet them, embracing Jillian, both women crying. The three of them sat in the garage for hours talking. When Pastor and Sadie finally went up to bed, Jillian went into the living room of the parsonage and sat quietly for the rest of the night, just watching her babies sleeping. She got down on her knees and thanked God for keeping them safe and for returning her home to them. She had thought of very little else other than this moment for the past 2 weeks. Then as her thoughts turned to Benjamin, she wept silently for her husband. By the time everyone started waking up, Linda had a roaring fire in the wood stove and a pot of coffee on the boil. Lee and Cheryl were helping her. They were frying up a can of textured vegetable protein we had stored, along with some powdered dehydrated eggs. They cut up a bunch of fresh apples to go with it and had a pot of steel-cut oats boiling also. She rehydrated some maple syrup powder we had stored for us to use this morning on our oats. As Pastor gave the morning devotion, he reminded us of how good God is to us and thanked him for bringing Jillian home safely. Richie looked over at her sitting with her babies and just smiled and said, "Amen, preacher." Afterward, we started back at our daily assigned tasks. Pastor went off with Sadie, Jillian, and the kids. They went into the office inside the church and were enjoying some family alone time. Linda, Lee, and Cheryl were cleaning up the makeshift kitchen from breakfast, and Jolie was in the infirmary, organizing and re-inventorying our supplies. Josh was with her. I had taken over the firewood processing for the day from Pastor and was out back chopping some wood when Jillian appeared from around the corner. She came over and sat down near me on one of the large stumps. She told me how grateful she was that the guys and I had risked so much to come retrieve her last night. How she was so thankful to be back with us and safe. We talked for a while. She told me about everything that happened at the hospital when the EMP went off, about all the terrible things she had seen, the things people did to each other in their desperation. She told me how Benjamin had died. It was chaos at the hospital. Some of the staff had walked out after the EMT to try to get home to their family. Some of the staff had just walked out after the EMP trying to get home to their family. Others who stayed to try to help had to do the jobs of those that left. Benjamin was running in several different directions at once. Checking on some patients on one of the floors, he had to go down to the pharmacy to get some meds because there was no orderly or nurse left in that area to do it. When he got downstairs, he saw a group of looters breaking into the pharmacy to steal drugs. He tried to stop them. There were 3 of them, and one swung a chair at him and hit him in the back with it. He grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and slammed it into his head, knocking him down unconscious. The other 2 guys jumped him and beat him badly. One of the nurses from another floor found him, and she went and got a doctor. Together they carried him to a bed in the hall. They did what they could for him. With no power or lights and no equipment working, their resources were extremely limited. He died 8 hours later with his wife by his side holding his hand. He never did regain consciousness. Jillian was like a little sister to me. I knew she was devastated, no matter how she tried to keep her composure. One Thanksgiving, when my son was with his mom and her family, I was alone and had nowhere to go for the day. Richie invited me to the evening service the day before Thanksgiving at our church. Pastor preached a great message, really spoke to my heart, and made me realize how fortunate I was in life. Richie introduced me to him after the service. He had such a humble and warm spirit. The 3 of us talked for a while, and it felt like I knew him my whole life. By the time I left church that evening, he knew my whole story. He insisted that I join him and his family for Thanksgiving dinner the next day. Jillian and Benjamin were going to host it at their house, several miles away. I didn't know it then, but Richie must have told them that I was living out of my car since my divorce a year earlier. After that Thanksgiving dinner, Pastor and Sadie invited me back to their house to watch a movie. We ended up having turkey and sandwiches and more pie and coffee that night after watching 2 movies. It got late and they invited me to stay in one of their spare rooms. Pastor took me aside after breakfast the following morning and asked where I was living. I confided in him about my situation, and he insisted that I stay with them until I got my feet back on the ground, as he put it. I ended up becoming like one of their family. Jillian and the kids were always there when Benjamin worked long shifts. He had 2 other daughters as well. One lived out of state with her husband, who was in the military, and the youngest was still in high school and lived home. Sadie and Jillian had worked behind the scenes to fix me up with Linda, who had known Jillian since she was a little girl and had been attending the church for over 20 years. Now this young lady, who became like a sister to me, had lost her husband, the love of her life, and she was devastated. Benjamin and Jillian had met in the youth group as children in the church and had grown up together. They always knew that they were meant for each other. Jillian had never even considered the possibility of there being anyone else for her. They married young and started having children right away. They had a whole beautiful life plan together. I think with everything that happened at the hospital and just trying to survive, the reality of Ben's death hadn't fully set in for her until after she got back. Until her daughter looked at her with her big, innocent brown eyes and asked, "Where's Daddy?" Later that afternoon, Steve, Richie, and I were sitting at the table downstairs in the garage finishing our lunch when Pastor came over and sat with us. He told us he wanted to talk to us about something. He shared how he had felt somewhat responsible for the death of the Timothys. Now last night, when I relieved him in the tower, we sat and talked for a while as we usually did when we exchanged tower duty. He shared that he felt if we had initially gone out to retrieve the Timothys, they would not have been bicycling on the road when Neil was killed and Catherine fatally wounded. We would have secured the supplies from their home when we picked them up, like we had done at Pastor's and at Greg's house. It was quite likely, he thought, that David would still be alive as well. He told us that there were many church members living within 10 miles of the property, and that he tosses and turns at night thinking of them, running out of food and water, stranded, alone. What an enormous burden he bears as pastor of this church, to feel such deep responsibility for all these people. He said he knew that the majority of our supplies came from the 3 of us and our efforts to prep over the years. He also said that he knows Richie and I brought up this concern in men's prayer group before, and it was met with skepticism and even criticism by some members. He said he wanted us to consider searching for and retrieving as many of these members as we could. He said that ultimately it would be our decision if we wanted to share our supplies with the others, and he understood if we did not. He asked us to just think about it. He said he didn't want to put us on the spot and he didn't need an answer right now. Again, he said, just please think about it. With that, he got up and walked away. Right away, Steve, who was an outsider to our church, said, "Well, it would be nice to have more people to help out with stuff around here." Richie quickly snapped back, "Yeah, but all those people gotta eat, too." Now, Greg was always trying to advocate more manpower and resources to search and patrol efforts. He felt that we needed to know who and what was out there around us. That if there were abandoned homes and businesses and people there, we needed to find them before anyone else did, and to secure what supplies we could. With all that needed to be done in camp, we went out as often as we could, but with as many guys as we could, but it just wasn't never enough. If we had more people, we could step those efforts up. For myself, it wasn't a hard decision to make. I had buried some supplies on the property, and Steve brought most of our collective supplies when he came. The three of us could have put our families in the truck with all our supplies stuffed into the camper and left at any time. We chose to stay. We chose to share what we had with the people who had become like family to us. Richie cautioned that with more people, our stored food would diminish at a faster rate. But for Steve, it was already settled. "We are all in this together. I'll take the extra help and make the best of it," he said. "This is the hill I choose to live and die on." This decision would end up coming back to be a blessing to Steve. None of us had any way to know it now, but somewhere out there was a man who he would rescue that would die 4 months from now. And on that day, he dies taking a bullet that was meant for Steve. In the end, we had one fact that we couldn't dismiss. We were a Bible-believing New Testament church. It was clear to us that, as such, we were still under the authority of our pastor. We should submit to his authority. If he felt the need to gather the flock, none of us would question that decision. At that moment, some 8 miles away, up in the hills to the northwest, there was an old homestead. It had been a working dairy farm until the 70s. It totaled more than 30 acres and was home to the Fairley clan. The patriarch was Carl Fairley. He was a soft-spoken gentleman with a heart of gold. He was married to Abigail, his childhood sweetheart, and together they had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. Carl did a stint in the Army after high school. After that, he worked in northern Ontario as a wilderness guide for people that wanted to learn how to survive in the harshest winter conditions. He would take groups into the wilderness in northwest Canada for weeks at a time, with nothing more than what they could carry on their backs. But he returned home to the family farm after his dad passed in 1992 and took charge of the homestead. Shortly after, he and Abigail got married, and they started a family together. They grew crops that they sold at farmers markets and the general store in the village near where they lived. They sold eggs from their chickens and rabbits that they had bred and raised, and honey from the beehives that they kept. They lived simply, Abigail hand-making all their clothes, and them producing almost everything they needed on their homestead. They were almost completely self-sufficient. They were members of our church. Carl was a loving husband and father. He was a rigid man as well at times. Once when I went out to visit him, it was raining. As I drove up, I saw his youngest daughter in the woods on the side of the house. She was bent down, trying to start a fire in a fire pit. Carl standing in the window watching her. When I asked about it, he said that the kids needed to know these basic survival skills. "She has to be able to start fires if she ever needs to," he said, "and I won't always be around there to help her. And it won't always be sunny and dry and warm during hard times. It's for her own good." Well, this seemed harsh to me, but then after she got the fire going, he ran out to her side. I saw him through the window as he hugged her and instructed her on how to nurture and grow and shelter the fledgling fire from the rain. He sat on a log next to her in the rain for about 10 minutes, talking to her. As they walked into the house together, he told her to go get some dry clothes on and said, "Honey, you did an awesome job. I'm so proud of you." She was beaming as she ran upstairs to change out of her wet clothes. Back at the church, as the 3 of us were discussing Pastor's plea to round up other church members, Carl Fairley and his 3 sons, Zeb, age 20, Zach, age 18, and Thaddeus, age 13, were riding single file on horseback down a dirt road that led into their village. Zeb led the group, a .357 revolver holstered at his side, and a Marlin .30-30 lever-action rifle in a scabbard tied to the right side of his saddle. Zach was next, with a 9mm sidearm and a Russian SKS rifle slung over his shoulder. Then came Thad, who had a Ruger PC-9 9mm carbine rifle in a scabbard to his right side. And finally, in the rear was Carl. He had a .45 caliber 1911 holstered at his side, and he was holding his AR-15 rifle, with the butt of the stock resting on his right thigh, pointing straight up in the air, his index finger resting just outside the trigger guard. He held his reins loosely, so that his horse would just follow the horse in front of it. This allowed Carl to constantly scan the woods to each side and ahead, and not have to watch where he was going. Zeb lived in a cabin on the property that he built with his own hands. He had no running water or electricity there. It was too far back in the woods for that. He liked the solitude. He was the best tracker and hunter in the family, and usually led on the trail, leaving Carl free to watch them all from the rear. They were on their way down into the valley. Back at the church, we told Pastor of our decision to support him in his efforts to round up the church members in the area and bring them back, if they wanted to come. We spent the rest of the afternoon into the evening making a list of nearby members and formulating a plan to visit them. As it got late, we slowly started going to bed for the night, until just Richie and I were left in the garage. Richie offered to take first watch. I told him I'd be back in a few hours to relieve him. It started snowing as I walked up to the church. It was a beautiful night to be alive. Thank you all for watching. Like and subscribe. I appreciate it. God bless you.